Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Mendelson, and I'm faculty in the Psychology Department of the Kaiser University Graduate School. I am an industrial and organizational psychology practitioner by training. My research spans many topics, though. I've studied medicine, artificial intelligence, diversity, equity, and inclusion, emotional intelligence, and political maltreatment in the workplace. One of the best courses I ever have the opportunity to teach, though, is evolutionary psychology. So I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be with you today to discuss this, one of my favorite courses to teach. I appreciate each one of you taking the time to spend with me today so that we can continue the exploration of the topics and principles of evolutionary psychological theory that we began discussing in the first part of this lecture that you've probably already viewed in your course. I do want to take a moment, though, and remind everyone that a lot of the topics we discuss in evolutionary psychology, they can be rather contentious. Some people have very strong personal feelings about many of these issues, and I want to be clear that I understand, I accept, and I respect your personal views on these different issues. However, in order to adequately address the topics, there are times I'm going to have to present information with which you may not agree. Please be aware, though, that my intention is simply to educate. My intention is not to be offensive. It is not to challenge your ideals, your values, your culture, your customs and norms. I intend to present information, and when I do present information that asks you to question things, please know I'm asking you to question the science. I'm asking you to question the information and the data that has been generated by people who have conducted research in this particular field. With that stated, I think the most important thing to recognize is that, as a rule, psychology doesn't operate in absolutes. We operate in most of the times and maybes. And what I mean by that is that these principles that I'm presenting to you today, they're not rules. They're not absolute. They do not apply all of the time to 100% of the human populace of our planet. What we do know about social science is that when you've done good work, your research is generalizable or applicable to large groups of people. With that said, please be aware that, of course, we have to recognize the fact that someone may be a person to whom anything we learn in psychology may simply not apply. So, please recognize I'm here to inform you so that you can form your own opinions on these different topics. And in the event that something presented does happen to offend you, please note that as a scholar, I have an ethical obligation to present the information that's supported by the data and historical fact without any preconceived notions, personal opinions, beliefs, biases, or prejudices of my own. Okay? So, with that said, we can jump right into it and have an interesting discussion today. So, we engage with other human beings, and when we do, there are very limited ways that interaction can possibly progress. So, for example, if you were to meet someone, you're either going to meet them and move on and not have interaction with them at all from that point forward, or you're going to form some type of a relationship with that person. Now, one of the types of relationships that can potentially come to fruition is called a cooperative alliance. Okay? Enemy type relationships can also occur. Typically, when an enemy relationship forms, you end up with situations where there will eventually be conflict, potentially warfare, certainly a degree of distrust or unhappiness with the person that you've met. Now, these interactions are certainly not limited just to individuals. And what I mean by that is, very simply, all of us belong to different groups. We belong to social groups. We belong to groups based on our hobbies, perhaps our social identity, our sexual identity, our political ideals or values, our religious faith. All of these different types of groups also interact with other groups. And interestingly enough, when these different groups interact, Well, the same types of relationships can be formed. So, when a relationship happens and it involves some type of like mutual continued involvement, um, this can lead to cohesive development of, or even active efforts to undermine the status, the prestige, and the social dominance of the different groups or different individuals who are engaging in these relationships. Now, sometimes there are great costs that are paid by people who are seeking to undermine the status, the prestige, and social dominance of others. Um, there are, of course, also sometimes tremendous benefits to doing so, dependent on what the end goals are of individuals. We see this type of thing happening pretty much all the time when it comes to, positions of global power. Different companies, different countries seeking to either bolster and strengthen or weaken and undermine the prestige of some of the world powers. And the reason to do that oftentimes can be social, can be economic, can be many different things. Um, but essentially, these interactions are really all demonstrations of different aspects of human behavior. And it's important to recognize that all aspects of human behavior, it's really just the manifestation or the outward demonstration of all that a person has experienced. Everything a person has previously had happen to them or have been a part of, the way they've processed that, the way they've categorized that, and the way that their brain has interpreted those events. So, once we have experienced things, our brain has categorized them, processed, and interpreted them, then as future events present themselves to us, or future stimuli presents themselves to us, we tend to respond to those based on our previous experience, our rationale, and our emotion. And oftentimes there can be great conflict between the rational aspect of behavior and the emotional desires of behavior. Um, to give an example, sometimes we know something is, let's say, it's legal, okay, under the laws of whatever land a person happens to be in. This desired action may be legal, but it may not be morally right. So sometimes what's legal is not moral, and other times what's moral is simply not legal. And we need to determine how we are going to behave in those challenging circumstances, heavily based on the experiences that we have had previously. And that's why evolutionary theory is so important. Because evolutionary theory is really the first field of study in psychology that recognized our experiences shape our behavior. And that's why we behave the way that we do. So, with that stated, when it comes to forming cooperative alliances, more often than not, the groups that form these cooperative alliances, they typically have a shared goal or a common goal in mind. And what that reminds me of, there's an axiom or a saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So this is really apropos when we think about the idea of cooperative alliances, because let's say, for example, two groups of people are living relatively close to one another. They don't have any serious problems or conflicts between the two groups. They're both living their own lifestyles and everything has been fine for many, many years. But all of a sudden they face a common enemy. That common enemy could be another group of people. It could be, like we've all experienced at this point, a global pandemic. Every nation on earth is trying their own things to combat the spread of a sickness. Whenever groups of people face this common enemy, whatever form that enemy may take, typically you will see cooperative alliances that are formed. So, what are some examples then, in real life anyway, of what these cooperative alliances may look like? How do we see them? How do we experience them? And in our everyday life, In what situations do these cooperative alliances end up forming? So, we certainly see this in political circles. You may have elected or appointed officials, and in order to accomplish tasks that they desire to complete, sometimes these officials will form alliances with one another. Even if they come from conflicting parties or conflicting political ideologies, if they have one common goal in mind that they're seeking to accomplish, it's not uncommon to see these different groups of people choosing to work together with one another, even if it's just on that one project, that one thing, that one piece of legislature or law that they want to be able to complete and potentially enact. So, in political circles, cooperative alliances can be formed when these elected or appointed officials are trying to complete a very important task that is going to end up benefiting everyone as opposed to just their own social group. Within professional circles, we see this as well. We will see individuals and businesses that will form professional relationships that are what we call mutually beneficial, meaning both parties or all parties involved will benefit somehow from the formation of this alliance or coalition, whatever you choose to call it. In professional circles, business circles, typically it relates to fiscal profit, money, revenue. So with this in mind, people may team up, and in teaming up, they create a mutually beneficial situation so that both parties can benefit from it. One example, Apple computers. Apple computers, they make iPhones, right? iPhones. And Apple computers, they are the company that creates the iPhone. However, they are not necessarily the company who creates every single individual piece required to build the iPhone. With this in mind, Apple has to come to some sort of arrangement or agreement with the company that makes the screen, with the company that makes the chips, with companies that develop different pieces of hardware that they need to be able to build their phones. So with this in mind, Apple is probably engaging in professional circles in which they are creating a mutually beneficial alliance with companies that make the parts necessary to generate a working and functional iPhone. Families form cooperative alliances all the time. And the reason why is they want to drive the growth and benefit to all the people in the family. So, for example, think about a family in which one person somehow is able to garner or generate enormous wealth. Well, it's not uncommon that that person will take care of his or her family, meaning spouse and offspring first, and then perhaps siblings and the offspring and spouses of siblings, and perhaps their parents, and put money away for future generations of their families. But the reason that they do this is for the benefit of all future family members, right? We also have situations in which different families will sometimes come together for the betterment or beneficence of their group as a whole. We saw this many years ago in medieval times on the continent of Europe. It was not uncommon to see a prince from one kingdom marrying a princess from another kingdom. And the reason why that this happened was the kingdom of the prince and the kingdom of the princess, upon their marriage, as they became one, as a couple, as they became one, so too did the kingdoms. That led to more strength, more resources, more wealth, more ability to defend themselves against external forces. And in doing so, it ended up strengthening both of their kingdoms. So this is an example of two different families, the royal families in different areas coming together in an effort to strengthen both of their family positions. But social groups also form cooperative alliances. Social groups form cooperative alliances because they're seeking to facilitate social change, the betterment of life for all members of the aligned groups. So, where can we see that in our societies today? Well, here in America, we are experiencing some degree of what we call civil unrest. There are different groups of people who are protesting because they feel that they have not been fairly treated. With this in mind, there are groups who are also kind of teaming up together to be able to have a larger impact when they stage protests or rallies or something of that sort. Different areas of the world, this may not happen, depending on the laws that govern the local area. So with that said, there may be different examples of social groups forming these coalitions or cooperative alliances to try and facilitate the social change that they seek. And in an effort to do that, it still does come back directly to the adage I mentioned earlier of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You may have two groups who are seemingly very disconnected. However, if they have a common goal, a common reason, or a common cause to work against, it is not uncommon to see these types of groups form these alliances. So, where does status, prestige, and social dominance come into play? So, you have modern status and you have primitive status. Okay? So, let's think about it this way. Things in the modern world are quite different than the way things were in a primitive world. In the modern world, people are not as often fighting over land and territory. They're more likely fighting over resources or over wealth, or people fighting for freedom of some sort or what they perceive to be a better life. So there are differences in the reasons why people are fighting. However, that core motivation of what makes people become aggressive and demonstrate aggression is very much the same. Aggression can result from, very different places, but it is manifested often in a very similar way. You're going to have conflict, you're going to have fighting. Many times people seek prestige. Prestige meaning that they have some form of like social dominance, some ability to kind of overwhelm or overpower others who may not be the same as them or may belong to a different in-group or out-group. So with that in mind, social dominance comes into play. Historically speaking, we saw that people who had the most physical power, the most weaponry, the most devastating weapons, the most strength in their military, were typically the groups who drove social change. There's another saying, history is written by the winners of wars. Obviously, those who have succeeded and won great battles are going to be the people whose story will be told for time immemorial. Status, prestige, and social dominance also manifest as changes and challenges that society is going to face. So status is incredibly important because status is a measurable trait that is used to influence access to more desirable things like mates. And we spoke in our first lecture and discussed the way that mating motivates a lot of human behavior. So we also see that prestige is typically gauged by, the trappings of wealth, notability, nobility back in the day when we were dealing with royal families, or, even wealth and the ability to, frankly, impose their will on others. So social dominance can be the result of this status or prestige, and that can lead to, or even be caused by, somebody being given access to or the title of some type of powerful position. So a person who climbs to a position of power, they actually have a choice that they can make. They can either go one way and be benevolent, meaning kind and gentle, or they can go the other way and they can be malevolent, which means inherently evil. Um, the powerful role is it's a position that frankly not all people are equipped to be in. Um, I've been bringing in a lot of old sayings and things like that. Here we have a saying. It says, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So many times people who are given unchecked absolute power, they end up being malevolent because they tend to begin viewing their subordinates or people who they're governing as somehow being less than themselves. The choice between being benevolent as a leader or malevolent as a leader is not something that we easily make. It's not something that we do necessarily on a conscious level. Oftentimes it's something that happens as a result of experience in that position. So power can have this intoxicating effect on a person and can lead even the most honorable people to act in ways or make decisions that may be viewed as being a compromise of their integrity. So, as I discussed in the first part of this lecture, evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology, when we think of them in terms of a theoretical construct, they influence a variety of specializations in the field of psychology. So take a moment and reflect on or think about the manner in which in-group and out-group processes influence the way people interact during everyday life as they walk around the streets of the cities they live in or the towns that they live in. That aspect of evolutionary theory, in-group and out-group processes, it deeply influences social psychology in that manner, because social psychology is the science and study of the way that human beings interact with one another. And we know that so many of our behaviors and our responses to others, whether we know them or not, are predicated on whether or not we deem that that person is a member of the same in-group to which we belong. So now let's take a second and think about the way that parents and children interact with one another. The way that the development of our children is influenced by the way that their parents, their step parents, foster parents, adoptive parents influence the development of their personality. The life experiences that a child has. Obviously, the life experience of a person who's fortunate enough to grow up with both of their own biological parents in a healthy, well-adjusted home may be different from those of a person who, unfortunately, their biological parents, they're not good parents and their home is not healthy and well-adjusted. And you see the same factors come into play when you have step parents. There are some incredible step parents who love those children, and there are some step parents who they're really not involved in the lives of of their stepchildren. Foster parents the same way. There are some people who open their home because they truly want to make a difference and they want to have a positive impact on the kids who need it most. And unfortunately, there are people who open their homes to kids because they get a paycheck to allow kids to sleep in their home and to eat in their home. Adoptive parents, very much the same. Some adoptive parents are absolutely wonderful, and others not so much. So with this in mind, we know that the way that a child develops into a young adult and that young adult develops into the adult that they're going to become, the developmental aspect of that person's life is heavily influenced by the theories of evolutionary psychology as they apply directly to the concept of parenting. Now think about a major part of adult life: our work, our profession, our field, our career. Well, concepts of evolutionary psychology, nepotism, cronyism, how do these issues impact the workplace? Have you ever worked in a place where perhaps someone was given a job or was given a promotion for which they were not the best candidate, but they were able to get that position not because of how good they are at their job, but because of who they're friends with, or perhaps who they're related to? Well, evolutionary theory absolutely influences industrial and organizational psychology, and that's only one example of how it does that. In addition, our life experiences oftentimes heavily influence the fields that we choose to work in as adults. For example, if you've grown up in a home where both of your parents are educators, it is not uncommon that you too will become an educator. The same thing rings true if your parents are physicians or attorneys or police officers. It is not uncommon that children will grow up and want to follow in the footsteps of their parents. That's an evolutionary psychological principle. Clinical psychology, heavily influenced by evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology because of the fact that we study human behavior. We try to develop ways that we can help people who are suffering from mental illness or conditions through therapeutic intervention. As such, evolutionary theory comes into play because of the way that evolutionary theoretical constructs, it presents the human ability to modify our behavior, the way that we can change how we act now based on lessons we've learned from past experience. That's the process of learning. So that's the thing that I think oftentimes people, they get it confused. In psychology, when we talk about learning, we're not talking about, a person who can remember things. We're talking about modification of behavior based on prior experience. So as we work through processes that clinical psychologists who are practicing clinicians may use, like cognitive behavioral therapy, what we're actually doing is attempting to rewire someone from their negative experiences, perhaps, that have led them to behave in a way that we would consider to be socially maladaptive or inappropriate, and to change how they behave into a more socially acceptable manner. And we wouldn't be able to even work through those processes if it was not for evolutionary theory guiding us in the early stages of the development of this. So, okay, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of aspects of evolutionary theory that can be viewed as contentious. In addition, and with respect for the fact that there are cultural differences depending on where people are located, depending on the laws that govern them, I want to make sure I again remind you, I'm presenting this as factual information, and I'm not doing this in any way to, be perceived as offensive. I hope I'm not. If so, I apologize for that. But dependent on the specifics of the things that I've mentioned, like your geography, where you're located, your culture, even linguistics, the way that people have been raised, their religious faith, their political ideals and values, you may feel differently about these different topics. But the reason that I bring this up at this point is that, as should be evident at this point, there's a broader perspective of evolutionary psychology. There were very few behaviors that human beings engage in that are not related to the principles of evolutionary psychology and the theory of evolutionary psychology in some way, shape, or form. So, as such, it's important for me to account for the influence of evolutionary theoretical influences to be able to understand human behavior from a more complete and more well-informed perspective. So depending on where you are or your different beliefs, you may agree with some of the tenets of evolutionary theory, and you may not. You may disagree with them. Either way is okay. My goal today is that I inform you about what evolutionary theory says, and then you can form your own opinions through the process of critical thought and hopefully some really in depth and really meaningful discussion with your professor. So, these are principles that are being presented so that you have the ability to think about them and kind of as an individual work to determine how much or how little these principles impact your life as an individual, the world around you that you experience on a daily basis, and how you choose to behave in the future. So, as at this point you should be aware, um, there are issues that evolutionary theory influences and impacts, and it's something that, depending on where you are, what your beliefs are, how you engage in the world around you, whether it's waking up, going to work, coming home, whether it's getting involved in some form of civil service, whether that be military, paramilitary organizations like perhaps your local police, your local fire department, um, if you are involved in political activity, if you're working in some way for the government, wherever you are, whether it be local government or federal level, country level governance, um, the way that we perceive people, the way that we interact with people, and it's important to recognize a lot of times the people we interact with, uh, we react differently to people with whom we identify, people who, as they say, look like us, than we do with people who look different than us, people who clearly come from different backgrounds, people who have had different life experiences. Um, but with this in mind, uh, if we do not take the time to have an understanding of the reasons why we are inclined to behave in certain ways, well, we can be more judgmental. We can be harder on ourselves when we make the effort to police our own actions than we would be if we didn't understand where it's coming from. So, if you look at the slide that you see before you right now, I mentioned politics. Um, so, wherever someone is in the world, your your country influences every other country in the world. And the influence oftentimes comes through policy that is created within one nation that then influences other nations. For example, let me just give you an example. Let's say, for example, that our policy here in the United States began to be every bit of waste that we have, garbage, we should just dump into the ocean off the coast of our country. Well, obviously, that would not impact just the United States. That would impact everybody around the world because we share the oceans. The oceans surround all continents. So if we're pouring garbage into those oceans, obviously it's not going to just stay off the coast of the US. It's going to move around the planet through the currents of the water, and it's going to cause problems for other nations. So the way that we engage with one another is heavily influenced by evolutionary theory. And the reason why is, I think we've probably all seen that there are nations in this world that, well, their power comes from controlling a resource, or their power may come from military might, but the way that they interact with other nations is not as positive as it might be if they were trying to interact with people with whom they identified. People who, and the air quotes again, look like them. Uh, this is an issue because of the way that we believe things about other groups. People, as a rule, are very quick to identify with people who clearly have shared commonalities, shared characteristics, and experiences. And then we tend to spend more time with people with whom we believe we have shared experiences and these commonalities. Now, oftentimes the result is that we develop negative beliefs about other people who are different from us, people who don't have a shared culture with us or shared values. Instead of looking at these people and seeking to learn from them, how they're living, how they're adapting to their environment, how they are functioning, and perhaps embracing some of their principles and ideals and implementing them in our own experience, in our own life, oftentimes we tend to look at things that are different as bad. And that's because of the way we view others, as well as the way we view ourselves. We look at ourselves and we tend to separate ourselves from other people, somehow believing that we are at a higher level of stature and everyone else is beneath us because they're different. This is something that evolutionary theory kind of dictates that needs to change. But change is challenging and change is very uncomfortable. I would like to leave you with an exercise. If everyone who's watching this would be kind enough to just cross your arms. Cross your arms. Now look around the room at the people who are next to you and ask the person next to them how they feel. How does it feel to cross your arms? Well, most people are probably going to be reporting that feels pretty comfortable. This is how they cross their arms. Now, cross your arms the other way. If your left arm was on top, this time put your right arm on top and cross your arms. Now look around the room. I would venture to say that most people are not nearly as comfortable now as they were before. It feels different. It feels unnatural. It feels a little bit less comfortable for them because they've been asked to change. They've been asked to change the way they've crossed their arms throughout their entire life experience. Change is uncomfortable. But here's the important question. When I asked you to change the way you crossed your arms, I'm going to go out on a limb here and venture to say that it didn't have an adverse impact. It didn't make anyone sick. It didn't make anyone ill. No one needed medical care. It didn't harm them in any way to make that tiny change when asked to cross their arms the other way. It was probably a little bit off-putting, maybe even a little bit upsetting, as change often is. But what we have to recognize is that much like being asked to cross your arms in a different way, asking you to change your behavior when it comes to the way you cross your arms, evolutionary theory recognizes that change is going to happen. Change will happen based on prior experience, and for the most part, most of the changes that we experience, if we approach them from a place of calm and rationale, most of the changes that we experience, well, they're going to be about as innocuous as me asking you to cross your arms the opposite way. It may make you a little bit uncomfortable, but after a time, you may even get used to it. You may never like it, and when no one's looking, you may still do it the way you like. But the fact is, there's no real harm that's done by asking you to modify your behavior. Now, the closing thought that I wanted to leave all of you with is that as evolutionary theorists, we need to accept our behavior will constantly and continue to change because of the experiences that we have. Think for a moment about how big an impact we could have globally if everyone chose to try to modify their behavior so we could somehow just be a little bit better than we are today. Evolutionary theory hopes that we can get to that place, but it recognizes that it's going to be a difficult path to walk. I would like to take a moment and thank all of you for being here with me today, for taking the time to listen to this lecture series, and for, playing along when I've asked you to do things like crossing your arms in a different way, or perhaps viewing a topic from a perspective that you had not viewed it from previously. I really appreciate each of you taking the time to be with me. I hope that you somehow benefited from this discussion, and I really look forward to future opportunities to engage with you, and I wish you all well. Thank you very much, and have a great day.